Okay, so thank you all for tuning in and joining us for this talk, which is being hosted by Artcite Inc. Option+Shift. We're very excited. Artcite is an artist-run center in Windsor, Ontario, dedicated to showcasing contemporary art within the Windsor and Essex region. We're excited to be continuing Option+Shift, which is our new series of online talks featuring digital artists and curators, whose work showcases some of the diverse conversations and perspectives being explored through digital media today. Through this series of talks, we hope to not only broaden our understanding of the digital medium, but also become exposed to different ways of working digitally, which have become even more relevant in our current COVID reality. Digital media has become a way for us to bridge social gaps, continue working remotely while still creating unique work through experimental and unconventional ways. And by talking about their respective practices, we hope these speakers will help us think even more expansively about what digital practices can look like. I'm so excited for our speaker this week, Xuan Ye. Xuan Ye is an artist, musician, and engineer whose work makes mixed media installation and performances synthesizing language, code, sound, body, image, data, light, and time. Their recent work explores the poetic forces of media, coupling with non-human agencies to experiment with world building and system modeling in the speculative space of sensorium that is beyond our consciousness. And I have borrowed that language from Ye's artist statement, so thank you for that. So I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll pass things off to Xuan Ye. We would like to express our gratitude and acknowledge that our work today takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. Artcite is located on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. Through these online platforms, we are able to host conversations with guests across other cities, including Toronto or Toronto, which is the ancestral traditional territories of the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. We would also like to acknowledge that an acknowledgement is just an acknowledgement and is not an act of reconciliation or decolonization in itself. This should prompt us as settlers to think about our responsibility to this land, as well as our relationships to Indigenous groups who continue to face violence, erasure, and displacement, but the legacy of colonialism, which we as settlers benefit from. This includes us at Artcite as we try to make long-term changes towards more equitable programming, which includes making space for Indigenous, Black, and intersectional perspectives. I forgot to do this at the outset, but I'd also like to introduce myself. I'm Artcite's programming coordinator, Imogen Clendenning. So I'll be moderating the discussion and facilitating a Q&A after Xuan Ye's presentation. And just before we wrap up, for the secondary half of our conversation today, if anybody would like to ask Xuan Ye a question at the end, at our question and answer period, you could either write your question into the chat window. You can open up the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You'll see chat. You can open that up and then write a question into the chat function. Or if you prefer to articulate your question through voice, through audio, then you can just type into the chat, "I have a question in all caps." Something of that nature, and we will unmute you so that you can pose your question directly. So that's everything I have. Xuan Ye, could I pass things off to you?
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with us as well.
Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Artcite, for inviting me, and Imogen for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen now for my presentation. Okay. All right. Yeah, first of all, I would like to briefly introduce my background, which I found it's always a very important context for understanding one's artistic practice. But we don't have a lot of time here, so I'll be very brief. If you are interested in learning more, I've unfolded a lot of the details in other talks and interviews of mine, which can be found on my website. So I was born in China in 1989, which is a very significant year in terms of global social changes. And I grew up in many, many different places in China. Yeah, very stereotypically, I studied classical piano performance, but it was very serious and it was a very brutal training. Before I gave up and went to a normal high school, and I was a STEM kid when I was in high school, because in China you kind of have to choose your major in high school. So that led me to study STEM only majors for undergrad. I went to a business school in Shanghai and majored in e-commerce and finance. And then later on, I moved to another city to work at a transnational ad agency, doing data analysis. And I was also a bar singer by night. There's a whole nother story there. About in 2011, I moved to New York City for graduate school. Originally in business, but then I transferred to media and cultural studies after this first semester because of, it was New York City, a lot of cultural shock, language barriers, and just exploring my queerness on many different levels and, blah, blah, blah. I was working a lot as an art admin at very large institutions. I was booking shows for a music venue. In a nutshell, I've switched a lot of careers and relocated many times before I moved to Toronto in 2013. And this is where I started picking up web design development skills and eventually started a career in that. And I didn't start making art or the kind of music I make now until 2015. So here I am working at the intersections of all these three different areas. When it comes to making art, I'm basically still a kid. I think that's why my practice is a little bit all over the place at this stage, because I'm just very curious about learning all different media, not only just the digital. I'm also very curious to explore different subject matters in my works. But under the facade of this noisy and, like sporadic presentations and the aura around, new media technologies and interdisciplinarity, I think the core of my practice lies in experimenting with the poiesis. In other words, it's a practice of leading something into being, either meaning making or world building, through which I'm trying to synthesize all these sporadic nodes of my interests. And from what I can remember, I always rationalize things as, a rhizome or constellation in my mind. sort of like the idea of the internet, and is very, very present in all my works. And as the first sentence of my biography often goes, I make media poetry that synthesizes language, code, sound, body, image, data, light, and time. By media poetry, I would like to explain a little bit more about how that's come about. Firstly, digital poetry. It's this kind of poetic practice that has been following a very mixed lineage of literature and art movements that focuses on the materiality of language and its extended poetics. So things like movements like dadaism, fluxus, vispo, visual and sound poetry, music concrete, conceptualism, net art, especially hypertext, bio art, generative art, and machine learning, and etc. etc. The key point about this kind of practice is because of the development of digital media and technology, data, visual, sound, interactivity, all start to make semantic impact. And that's how they carry some levels of poetic forces. And to myself, I kind of have been exploring this practice for a while, and I summarize it to this very broad title, Sensorium in Techno, Text, and Textual Space. Sensorium means the sensory apparatus or faculties that's considered as a whole. So biologically speaking, it's like the stem of our body, but we could also think about it on a broader level. Techno-text, this whole body of thoughts, I borrowed from Catherine Hales, and it's about how we can think about cyberculture that help us rethink the relationships between form and content, and more specifically between the material aspects of the medium and the generated content. So yeah, I know this is like kind of like title of a PhD dissertation. Yeah, I'm really hoping I could get into it more in the future, but right now it's really sort of underlying in my artistic creation. To me, I try to summarize the shared methods or subject matters that are cross all three domains of my research creation. And the very first thing I came across like in my mind is making noise. Making noise is not just about sound, to my understanding. I consider myself make noise through translation, improvisation, and an algorithm. And as all words or concepts can function as metaphors, which will have many ontological and philosophical implications. Same with translation, improvisation, and algorithm to me. It's kind of like hypertext. So to me, translation is about bilingualism and multimediality. And improvisation is about intuition, chance, and computer randomness. And algorithm, it's not only about code, it's about rules, instructions, logics, and systems that are built with these three elements. And yeah, I've always found myself most comfortable navigating the poetic space because the poetic space allows noise. It allows negotiation, it allows glitches, it allows detachment, and all, etc. Yeah, and then the second shared method or a common theme in my practice is becoming. The idea of becoming in the Deleuze and Guattari's concept. It's a process of change or movement within an assemblage. And in this case, I consider my entire practice as an assemblage. And rather than conceive of the pieces inside of the assemblage as a whole, it also serves to account for the relationships that are between these discrete elements of the assemblage. And to me, as we're entangled with all these forces, I consider myself collaborate with non-human agencies such as machines. And within machines, there's AI, but there's also mechanical systems. There's also massive networks such as electricity. And there's also like the nature. But to me, I think coupling, or the idea of a symbiosis, it's not a new idea, and it's not about reinforcing the dichotomy. To me, it's about foregrounding the awareness and how something that's already there, that's already embedded, and how we can reinterpret it or rethink about it. And it's also about allowing the change in the assemblage, not only in art, but also more importantly, my own body, my own sensorium, our collective body, our collective sensorium, and the planetary body. So that's the theoretical framework I try very hard to summarize from my practice. And then I would like to talk a little bit about like the specific artworks through the logics or the chain of thoughts. But it's not necessarily like I always think about it before I make the work, but it's always something that's underlying, and most of the time it's an aftermath. The very first one is language as code, as data. This is very, very present on my website, which is a.pureapparat.us. So if you had a chance to go to my website, the homepage is showing this interactive Constellation visualization. Yeah, I consider this website as a total work of mine. It's been through 10 versions so far. But the homepage is always this animation. And if you go to see the source code, I consider this whole canvas as the mind. It's basically visualizations of the titles, all the titles of my work in both Chinese and English. And I basically see each word or character as a node and then visualize it through this graph, data visualization library called Forced Graph. Yeah, and this is actually gonna keep growing until I no longer update this website. So yeah, like this is a very good example of this logic, language as code as data. And the second one is language as image as code as data. This logic, I guess I just really want to show the work, the very first work, I consider my first work, which wasn't necessarily started from a idea of website. I had, you know, as many people have, you know, photos you take and diary or writings. So I kind of see all these materials as a big database, and I made it into this work from another to the other.com. Basically, it's a web site, or basically it's a blog, and it's accumulating my personal history. So every time you load this website or refresh the website, it will only show one post, either an image or a piece of writing, and that it's randomly chosen from the whole database of my my photographs. So in this case, I'm considering the writing or the image as data and at the same time as code. The next one, it's language or code as light as time. This is actually the example is what we were looking at the very beginning. It's this work, WYSIWYG. It's pretty literal. I basically transformed the text cursor into a neon light. And I consider, because it's such a interesting icon, I consider it as the ultimate metaphor for all texts. And right now, I'm working on an artist book in collaboration with Benjamin de Boer, and it's gonna come out next month. So yeah, if you're interested, please stay tuned for that. Yeah, and from here, this is a physical neon light. Yeah, I have a thing for neon light. Yeah, I also started to make web-based neon signs, you know, because it's not cheap to make real neon sign, and sometimes my ideas are not even possible to be materialized. For example, garden, this work is basically a sign of garden, but the anagram of garden, danger, will be flickering in the order. And I consider it's like this play with, you know, the back and the inner side of of a word, like danger and garden, they're seen to be the opposite, but they're actually embedded in the same, at the same time. Yeah, follow that. The next one is language as data, as code as sound, as light as time. This is best exemplified in my very first solo exhibition, which is etc. This exhibition had a few works in it, and it's all about thinking about technotext and digital poetics and how I can make work out of that. Yeah, for example, this work, Every Letter Cyborg, it's essentially a Twitter bot that I was playing with, using code to play with language that could be generative. And it will post as tweets automatically as if it's a cyborg. And this work I actually expanded a lot. It has 3 versions. The install view is like this printer that's printing out the tweets. And then later on, I made this visualization or sonification of the text. And another work following the web-based neon signs is In Between We Oscillate. Again, it's not something you can easily materialize in real life. But in this work, what I was playing with is, you know, how do we see, like I see the words in the shape of a waveform. So I take that image of a waveform and translate it into sounds, which is, you can play through the website as it goes. It's a little bit too loud, so I'm not gonna play it for now. But the texts are coming from an ESL book. There are pairs of antonyms. I kind of collect them and then make it as a database and then animate it in this scrolling way. So that's how I use this kind of logic and think about how we can create a chain of translation using code or other instructions. And more recently, I start to think more about performance, the performance aspect of my practice. Because for a long time, I play a lot of shows in various contexts, either movements or sound. And it's definitely something I learned from the practice of performing. I think about the body, not only as in the human body, but also a sculptural presence, you know, or, you know, the spatial presence and the relationship of all the other presences in the space with this body. So this leads to a few new works I've been working on. One of them is The Spectacles Before Us Were Indeed Sublime. This is actually an exhibition that's still ongoing. And it was the long-term project since 2018. In this project, I kind of experiment with a lot of new media. And as my concepts grow and evolve and need different media, I kind of have to learn those media on the fly. So there is a kinetic interactive installation, which is using a webcam and is capturing body motions and then translate that into like these kind of visualization. And then I project those images on objects. This one is the Henry Moore Sculpture Center at the AGO. And this one, it was at InterAccess. And I was using a mirror film to kind of expand this presence for the immersiveness. And same with using VR and brainwave sonification. It's all about, you know, how to think about the body in relationship with, you know, the surrounded. Yeah, and here is the data visualization of the VR user as they move in the VR scene. Their paths are documented or tracked, and this is like a fast forward time lapse version of how they're traveling. Another work is also pretty recent. I made it in the summer. This work was, I started it because I was invited to make a performance in Montreal, but because of COVID and, you know, like I didn't want to travel there. So I made this performance as a video. But basically in this work, I was considering sleep as a performance of doing nothing. You know, like, you know, at this time, just during COVID, I'm sure most people feel very unmotivated and unproductive. However, the reality is still like kind of forcing you to labor, because you gotta work, you gotta eat. Yeah, by just sleep. And while I was wearing a brainwave sensing headset, and I connect these interfaces to a software, and then it will generate these visuals, and it also modulate the song, the International. Yeah, the sound part is actually the core of it, but it might be too loud. Yeah. This is actually, yeah, just a side note. It's just my fondness of sloth. Like in this work, you can really tell like the super slow-mo movement and the sound. Yeah, so this work, it's currently, that's what I invest a lot to think about the relationship body and technology. And another one is All Tomorrow's Oceans. It's initially like a project like using artificial neural network to generate images. And then I sort of developed it into a live performance, like a AV performance. Sort of same idea, not exactly the same, but I'm also experimenting with camera, webcam, and body movement, and sort of integrated with these machine-generated moving images. Let me just show a little bit of that. Um, yeah, it's super long, it's half an hour. Yeah, and the very, very recent work, Telematic Allergies, I guess it's another, kind of a new direction of mine that's like trying to play with sculpture, you know, using e-waste to make interactive sculptures. And the key point and like theme in this work is to use these e-waste elements and pick up sound, electromagnetic sounds from electricity. And in this work, I consider I collaborate with all these different objects or materials, and seeing electricity as a material. Yeah, that's my presentation. Yeah, I encourage you to check out my website.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was amazing. I'm just gonna open up the chat window. Unless folks, feel free to submit your questions, or if you'd like to ask a question in person, I can unmute you. Oh, we have one. Hi, Xuan. Would you consider the theme of becoming as a product of cultural hybridity in terms of these intersections like light, body, language, or code? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry. Sorry, Xuan. Still muted. Oh, dear.
Okay.
Okay, there, much better.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And in my opinion, I totally see that as part of the becoming. I think, you know, because as a being, there are a lot of things in our context that will definitely contribute to this, like cultural hybridity, you know, technological mediations, and also like, yeah, just through day-to-day lived experiences, for sure.
I wonder about, you know, and not to like get too personal, but sort of what inspires you to make this work that is kind of, you know, partially focused in how the technological and the biological are converging in that relationship between the two. Is this something that you see, you know, represented in life, or is it something that you think about in sort of like a more theoretical way, or what?
Yeah, for sure. Like I think in all those aspects. But of course, like I said, I usually started making before I theorize things or rationalize it. And this work, you mean this e-waste work, right? Yeah. It was started from literally having too many CDs. And think about like all these obsolete consumer technologies, right? Like, I'm sure everyone has this experience, like probably have like iPhone 4 lying around somewhere, like you just don't know what to do with it. Yeah, and these most of the speaker calling in this work were also scavenged, and I kind of and just like take apart all these old machines that no longer work. One thing actually, this holder, this like antenna, like this octopus kind of look holder is actually a soldering machine, a station.
What?
Yeah, so basically I'm using all the elements from the workstation to make this work.
Oh, wow. I had no idea. I was like, oh my gosh. Well, because the CD-ROMs are so reminiscent to, you know, Flora, and there's this incorporation of, you know, plant matter. And when I look um, at the different wires, I'm thinking about veins, you know. Um, I myself am very obsessed with obsolete technology. And I was wondering if you would, you know, I mean, would you potentially think about obsolete technology as being connected to organic material in any kind of a way? I mean, if it becomes waste, then when I think about waste, I think about organic material. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Like you will think about them, like when you look at them, you're like, oh, because they're actually not recycle. Like it will just imagine like in decades after, like even after we die, like they're still just gonna be there because it takes forever to decompose. And yeah, I think there are things like the analogy of the vein, the cabling, and it's very a popular thought. Like I know a lot of people literally think computer is the brain, but I don't personally agree with that. But I agree that the analogy is there, and from that analogy, can we think more about how we could coexist, or or on a very practical level, like right, like when like I said, it started from like literally there's so many cities, but then I googled some methods, and I actually look into the recycling industry, and it's very interesting. And there's also like all these things about like how like garbage or recycling colonization, because a lot of these e-waste has a long history of like shipping to the development countries. Yeah, but actually back to this, what I was gonna say is, I found these like DIY projects about how to reuse or recycle these old technology that are really hard to be recycled.
Wow. Did it recommend melting them down, or what was the recommendation? I'm just curious now about how to recycle a CD.
Like literally melting the CD is like a domestic, like a housewife project. You will just really Google it and you will see so many of them.
It's a homemade disco.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question from Dermot Wilson. Thank you for such a clear and concise presentation of your artwork. The talk had me thinking about a dichotomy that resonates within my own artwork, and that is spontaneity and the craven, being the craved, polished, and presented over time, especially as you presented your projection installation at the AGO. For you, what is spontaneity, and is it important to your practice?
Yeah, it's I really feel that it's actually a constant persisting struggle of mine. like, I guess because I play music first and went to art school like after, more like in my adult time. I definitely see performing, like I'm an improviser, so like I'm like might be over spontaneous in my performances, because sometimes I'll show up without bringing anything, because I want to embrace that chance, like I want the space or the audience to fit me with some kind of motivation. While my art, like making installation, of course, obviously it could be intuitive or spontaneous, but to me, because I guess I'm not as skilled yet, so it actually takes a long time for me to prep and to plan it out. Yeah, like that struggle is very, very present in my work. I mean, for installation, I guess it could appear very polished, but like, I mean, if you work with me, I'm not a person who's like, it has to look like certain way. Yeah, I sometimes consider that just me being lazy, but like just open it up to chance or the situations. It's a good method, I think.
I'm not a musician, but I've sat in on musicians doing classes about like improvisation and collaboration, and I could just think about that being a really interesting way to come to performance and installation as an artist, having that background in musical improvisation, because from the from what I know, it's so kind of like perceptive, and you're always sort of thinking about how your body and how sound and image are relating to others, and anybody else who's in the room, sort of affects the journey. So does that play into your artistic practice, I guess, that that musical background?
Yeah, yes and no. I think I've been through a few stages. Like at first, they're like completely separate and completely like a hard dichotomy. But then, yeah, and this is why I kind of have to integrate all my. Right now, it's 3 different areas of working. Because it's just too tight. It's like exhausting. Yeah, and I think sometimes I definitely think like I'll blame myself or accuse myself, like, oh, why don't you just like like be more spontaneous in the process when you make art? Like, so it definitely, like, if I learn from each practice or like the improv background, yeah, but I'll say yes, I have that urge, but no, it's hard to achieve that.
Carl George just sent us a big list of questions. So I'm going to ask the first one because I love it, and then we'll flip back and forth, and I'll go back and forth to them. Is silence a form of noise?
Sure. I think to me, silence is like danger is the flip side of garden. Yeah. Silence could be noise, noise could be silence.
Let me see. Oh, we also have, do we even ever know silence? Good question. I have a hand raised from Artcite Inc.
Hi, Sean.
Hey.
Well, I don't even want to ask my question now that Carl has all these amazing questions. But I will ask it anyway. This might be a bit redundant, but I was kind of curious how that notion of world building that you mentioned at the beginning kind of ties into the current, how can I say this? Kind of ties into, or how it led you to the current mediums that you work with now. Like, do they have a very specific, or do they have a certain resonance related to world building that you feel is like really important to those mediums? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like as I was saying, like these thoughts or summary is coming after I make the work. So world building, I actually learned about world building because I was working with 3D animation and VR. That's like a very popular thing or idea. People talk about that. I think why I wanted to use 3D software is like, I guess I had the urge to build a world, like to for simulation. Yeah, and that's why I picked up those software skills.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's definitely like it's not going one way. It's like feeding back into each other.
Yeah, that's amazing. It seems like you're kind of making your world as you make, rather than preconceptualizing a complete world and then making, or like, yeah, like you said, it seems like a really feedback kind of a process. So very cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
Speaking about world building, I had a question about, what was it like to work with artificial intelligence? And because this is something with, I guess you could argue it's with its own agency. Is this a kind of collaboration between yourself and this non-human agency?
Yeah, like I guess I that's a really good question, because similarly to world building, I started to focus or like, frame my artist statement in that way because I started to work with machine learning and artificial intelligence. Exactly the same, like 3D software. That is also something very present in the discussions of machine learning. Yeah, and because of that, I started to think more about that. Like, I actually had a talk, like a discussion with a friend. She's saying like, when it's hard to understand what non-human agencies mean, instead of just using, like, a lot of people just say non-human, right? We hear this so much in the current like philosophical like debates, but I insist to use the word agency because it's such a term when we think about humans. How, especially in Marxism, like you think about like labor is related to the agency of individuals. Yeah, and also like that triggers me to think more about like to make it think about it more broadly, like, oh, actually electricity is also part of that, and
Wow.
and it's an area that's like needs more exploration. Like, I think AI yeah, AI is just too trendy, such a trendy subject that like I I like working with it, just use it as a tool, but I have no interest in, I'm not a scientist, so like I have no interest in like finding the solution for the humankind, you know, like I'm not interested in that. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you really did. You did. And I mean, I've never really thought about uh, the fact that, you know, yeah, like technology, like labor is a very human thing that brings with it its own level of agency. And so the idea that even something like electricity that we take so for granted as being this like, that it also has this kind of similarity to these newer, like flashier kinds of technologies that are trying to mimic the human. But yeah, and I guess that sort of leads me a little bit into I guess in my own mind I've always thought about like, oh, you know, if we're all always on our cell phones, are we all cyborgs? And I think that the concept of the cyborg is present in your work and has been. And yeah, I'm just like curious about that. I also had a question about, I have to pull it up. Sorry, I always have really long rambly questions.
No
That's
worries.
just the way I do things. The piece Every Letter Cyborg. From what I could see, it seemed like there was the perception of a cyborg presence in that work, but but the work is actually a fully automatic. It's a computer, it's a bot, and maybe the cyborg presence is the fact that it's created by you. Is that the sort of element of the cyborg happening in your practice, or?
Yeah, like, right. It's a very big question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm like trying to.
But I would love to answer that because, in my opinion, actually, this is part of my thesis. And my thesis was we are natural born cyborg. This is an idea from a neuroscientist from the 80s, I believe. So basically, he's saying if we see technology not only as digital technology, but as tool, like human started, like, you know, there's this very common differentiation about human that's different from the other animal. It's like we can use tool, and you know, not just like digital technology, like other tools can also, while you use it can also feedback to you how you function. And I consider that is already part of the coupling, I'll say. And yeah, and then to that specific work, it's actually more of a word play, because it's a Twitter bot, and there is a source text that it's drawing the words from, and the source text is the Cyborg manifesto. So I was like playing with this, like, oh, it's like a Twitter bot that's like talking about being a cyborg.
I love that. I love the Cyborg manifesto. So yeah, I wish I got to see that work in person, but thank you for speaking about it. Carl George says the cyborg goes back to World War I when Europe experienced horrendous human devastation caused by new machineries, machine guns, tanks, wounded soldiers, outfitted with artificial legs, etc. And the cyborg was born. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that idea of cyborg is like a physical, or like a end result of a cyborg. Yeah, and a lot of these innovation, like throughout like civilization, innovations are coming from military uses, right? Like, but yeah, I think I think about Cyborg more as a concept.
Mm.
Yeah. I actually kind of, because I've been reading, it took me a while to read through the 9 questions. But I want to say that, yes, I know the work of Christine Song Kim, I'm super aware of Noah Chomsky's work, and I fucking love him. Yeah, and all those influences. Yes.
Okay, well, we are past 3 p.m., which is usually when we'll close off a conversation is around 3. I have, I have more questions for you. I love your practice so much, and it was such a pleasure
Thank you.
getting to speak with you about it. I think we might want to round out soon just for the sake of, keeping it short and sweet, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, please everybody visit Xuan's website. It is amazing. Thank you so much for doing this with us for Option+Shift. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about your practice. So fantastic. And I'll be looking out for the publication that you have coming next month.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, do you want to plug it again?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also wanted to thank Ron Su as well, our admin administrator, who has been curating, Option+Shift, doing a fantastic job with all the organization of it. So we're really indebted to him as well. Okay, and with that, I'm going to close off.